every profession has its jargon, its argot, its language of its own. And that includes professional wrestling. And one of the most mysterious words of professional wrestling, not what it means, but where it came from, is kayfabe. And on today's episode of Life's Potluck Buffet, we are going to explore the word kayfabe and ask the cards about what type of jargon do we need to know to get to that next place in our work and lives. I'm John Paulus. You're listening to Life's Potluck Buffet, only on YouTube. If you've been enjoying Life's Potluck Buffet, please subscribe. And if you've already subscribed, thank you so much. I truly appreciate it. If you have a Brave browser, you can now contribute basic attention tokens to Life's Potluck Buffet with John Paulus on YouTube. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening. On an episode of Life's Potluck Buffet a little while ago, I talked about the lingua franca sabir, which was a Mediterranean lingua franca that combined many languages of people interacting with each other in Mediterranean trading posts and contexts, and in cities where lots of people from different language traditions and different places showed up together and had to do business together. Sabir was just one of many pidgin languages that facilitated communication in places of great diversity. And in fact, the word pigeon itself probably, not pigeon the bird, which that's probably from Old French and has to do with bird noises, that not that pigeon Pidgin, meaning a language. And that word comes from the phrase Pidgin English, which comes from Guangzhou in China, and it was a place where people needed to speak a language that was common to all of them, and it so happened, because of all sorts of facts of history, that language was a form of English that was called Business English, which in the sound changes involved in Guangzhou was called Pidgin English. Pidgin just being a local pronunciation of the word business. So that's all Pidgin means. It just means in the Chinese Pidgin Business English, the just means it's business. So that gives you a sense of being, well, when you're in the business, and that's important for wrestling because that's people who know the jargon and are working in the business, you're going to have a jargon for the business. And the jargon's kind of interesting too, because our jargon actually comes from a French word that means to chatter like a bird. It's probably onomatopoetic, meaning it sounds like what it means. I don't know what type of birds go jugga 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 jugga, but the chickens. Anyway, pigeons, which kind of make cooing noises, don't do the jargon thing, I guess. They kind of just coo. So that's a different onomatopoetic word that has nothing to do with jargon, but it is interesting that jargon comes from a sound that birds make. The word pigeon, as in the pigeon bird, not Pidgin English, we know that comes from the word business, but the pigeon, the bird name, also comes from a French word meaning to peep, like a bird, which is interesting because I don't think pigeons don't really make that sound, but I guess it got applied to them at some point. Anyway, that's pretty fascinating, I think, that both jargon and the word for the bird, the pigeon, come from the same kind of idea of the sound that birds make. Now, the and it's not understandable by anything but birds. That's why it's important that jargon means a language that's specific to a particular, say, business. Now, in professional wrestling, when someone who's not in the business shows up, wrestlers need to remember to stay in kayfabe, which is the state of being in the reality, I will say, of the stage wrestling theater, and to not, what is called in acting, break the fourth wall. the fourth wall being the wall between the invisible wall between the performers on a stage and the audience out there in the seats. And for all of history of theater, the playwrights and writers and actors have had scenes where the fourth wall is broken for whatever effect. That's always been a thing, from ancient times to modern times. And in wrestling, the intricate nature between life and art is probably one of the most heightened of any business that I can think of, because the fiction of the rivalries and sometimes even injuries or ups and downs or bankruptcies or windfalls are all staged, or at least supposed to be. But sometimes life becomes reality, and sometimes art imitates life. But kayfabe is the principle that the reality of the wrestling theater be maintained. And so where does kayfabe come from? Well, we don't really know. There are probably about 5 different explanations of where kayfabe comes from. One story that is told from the older days of wrestling and of professional wrestling is that when, say, a person who is not part of the business shows up in the dressing rooms or is backstage, that wrestlers would say kayfabe to out loud, and that the person is really confused about what's that about, why they always say that when he shows up. And that person, whose name was Mark, and this is why this is probably a legendary story, because that Mark means a person who's not in a particular jargon area. So it means that they're not in the business in wrestling. So a mark is, say, an outsider who's being fooled, let's say, by the kayfabe. And so the story goes that the person, Mark, said, "Why do you keep on calling me kayfabe? I'm a mark." And see, that's probably what tells us this is probably not exactly a true story, but it's a good one. And those kinds of stories that get spun around these words are just part of the whole show, because the words are part of a show, because there's a long, long history of jargons and argot that are long-standing languages spoken by theatrical, carnival, even groups of thieves that have a language that they speak to avoid being understood. And in the tradition of these languages in places where English is also spoken, the word can't was another synonym for this jargon or this kind of speech that was not understood by others. And the word can't might either come from, well, ultimately the same word that chant comes from in English, if it comes through Romance languages and has to do with singing and so forth, or it comes through other Gaelic languages that have to do with a word in Gaelic languages for talk or a type of speech. And I think a good example that you may know in your daily life, even though you're probably not part of a society of thieves, is the word fence. Not the kind of fence that goes outside a yard or something, but the kind of fence that means a person who sells stolen goods, not goods that they stole, but goods that someone else, a thief, stole. And this is thought to come from the word defense, which is basically that fence is a person who acts as a defense for the person who has stolen the goods, and they are therefore a fence. So that's one thought behind that word. But nonetheless, some thieves can't, even though you didn't realize it. And that's it. Whenever you hear the word fence, meaning a person who sells stolen goods for the person or persons who stole them. And there are a lot of words in our language that come from these various jargons of secret languages that are only meant to be understood by people in the business. But what about kayfabe? Now, as I said, there are several attempted explanations. The two for me that are most possible are usually the first two given, and that's one, that it's from a Pig Latin. So if you're familiar with Pig Latin, it's kind of like a child's version that pretends to sound like Latin, but it's really just English with various letters involved. Other languages beyond English have Pig languages like this that are sometimes called Hog Latin, which is slightly different from Dog Latin. But nonetheless, these are all pretend Latin-sounding things that started centuries ago to make it sound like you were saying something smart by using Latin words, but you were just using English words to make, to fill in for them. But the way Pig Latin works is you add an AY with the sound A to the last syllable of a word, and you make the first syllable of that word the last syllable of the new Pig Latin word. So, for example, I'll say the word fake would be kayfabe. So you could see already that the kayfabe is already sounding like kayfabe, and then the B part is supposed to be like B or B fake, right? So, but if you in the modern rules of Pig Latin, that would be eBay, not to be confused with the online sales site, eBay Aikfe. But there's no reason there couldn't be a kayfabe for kayfabe. But then that B, let's just say that it's not conclusive that kayfabe comes from B fake in a version of Pig Latin. But I can see how you could kind of make an argument for that. Also, the idea of keep cavey or keep cavey, and that has to do with being quiet or watching out because someone who shouldn't be who's not part of the business is around. So that meaning, keep cavey, is a jargony term from various different groups and cultures in the English-speaking world of a couple of centuries before. So that's another possibility. And the other ones are just too far removed and always involve someone named kayfabe, which just sounds like Melba from yesterday's episode, the supposed Australian inventor of the fanny pack. It's just having kayfabe just be a name sounds a little too implausible. So that's kayfabe. And let's ask the cards for something that we can use in our business, our shared business, if you know what I mean. Yellow lemons, blue dumplings, magenta noodles, cards, tell us somethings. Here we go. It's card 52. When it comes to life, we are all Dali. So in January 1957, the famously mustachioed artist Salvador Dali appeared on What's My Line, and he broke the game because What's My Line was all about what your profession is. And for Salvador Dali, that was not a straightforward question to answer for a person who didn't think of himself as one particular profession. So when the panelists would ask questions like, was he an athlete, or did he make drawings like comic strips, or was he a writer, or was he a leading man in movies? He said yes, because, he knew that he had participated in all of those activities, but the limits of our standard thinkings about occupations wouldn't allow us to accept that fact. So really, Dali showed how rich not just his life is, but all of our lives are. And once you understand how you are Dali in that moment, you can find liberation in that fact too. And I'll see you tomorrow on Life's Potluck Buffet. Savvy?